That's boring. Let's not talk about how I'm sick again. I got sick every other week for months in the winter in New York.
You look rough, man.
End of the day, man, I'm tired. I got tired. I think I just got tired. I've been...
Great time to record a podcast.
Yeah, let's complain about front-end web development.
Nice.
The Complaining Front-End Web Developer Show. Welcome back, everybody. This week, we're going to complain about...
We should just have a wheel that we spin.
It's called Twitter.
Twitter.
We're going to complain about what people are complaining about on Twitter.
Nice.
Seems like a never-ending source for material. We were just chatting. I had a conversation with someone. It's fun. People reach out to us sometimes about the podcast. I think the most common feedback we get is some form of, I love hearing that you guys are struggling with these things, that you're honest about the rough edges, and it makes me feel like I'm not crazy. Whether we're talking about Ember or we've been talking about React these past couple weeks, and it's like the same feedback. So it's like the whole middle class thing, right? It's like all of the stuff that people feel like they should know or it should be easy, but no one is really honest about. And I will say, as we've been kind of learning about Vue and React and these other ecosystems and talking about how they compare to Ember and what their strengths are to Ember and their weaknesses, I will say I think a strength of Ember is that it covers more of this area. I think it leaves less of the middle class unserved. Mm-hmm. And the way this guy was putting it was, just that there are certain things that aren't covered by the React docs and that might not even neatly fit into React's abstractions, that you end up having to create yourselves. And you do that through a combination of like ingenuity and blog post reading and reading in between the lines of Twitter conversations. And you usually find that there's like
guessing.
Yeah. There's 3 ways to do anything. And one of them is usually really a bad way to do it. And the other 2 are like equally viable, but have their own trade-offs. Or the problem is there's nowhere to find that stuff. And so it got me thinking, where is that true in Ember? Where is that true in React? And also like, what can we do about it too? Because I feel like that's a huge, it's like a thing that people don't talk about. So
can you give an example of this just so I track a little better?
Yeah. So like in Ember, if you wanted to, save a post with many comments, like you create a post and you create many comments, like what do you do? Like you're not going to find an answer to that in the guides. Yep. You're probably you're going to have a hard time finding a blog post about that. You're not going to find a conference talk where anyone talks about that. And yet that kind of thing comes up all the time in real world application development. We've hacked solutions in the past where you kind of like save a graph of data or you do like a waterfall. Those are basically your options. But again, if you're not experienced or just haven't run into that yourself, sure, anyone can do something on their own. They just need to figure it out. But it's much better, that wouldn't be Ember's answer when it was like, how do you create a comment? It would show you how to do it in an action. You call save, you call then, you can transition after that. Your store will be updated, right? But the same is not true for something like that. Now because React is a smaller library. And so if you say like, why doesn't the React guides have anything about data fetching at all? The only thing it has is a link to a blog post by someone that is basically endorsed. And you can hear folks on React core team say things like, well, that wasn't part of our responsibility. We think it is, and so we're working on it. But that's not really useful to someone building an app today. You'd rather hear like, here's how you do it today. There's something as an element of honesty to be able to say, here's how you do it today. That's actually what I want to know. Like, I get that it's not part of your grand plan today and it doesn't fit purely into your abstractions right now. But yeah, that's fine. I'm okay with that. You're not going to disappoint me if you tell me this is how you do it today and it's not ideal, because I want to get unstuck. Because the alternative is you're going to tell me we're working on something that's going to be ready a year from now, and then I'm going to go off and do the best I can, and it's going to be, I'm going to feel like I'm on my own.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to go all the way to the other extreme. The other extreme is Here's how you do everything. And I can't possibly give you advice for how to do everything, but I'm going to give it to you anyway.
Even though it's not, it would be better for me to say I don't know.
Yeah. I can't focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either one is a right answer. There's some middle ground.
Right. And the reality is people are building like whole applications with React today. So it'd be better for people starting out to know what people are doing. Maybe it's a community thing. I was thinking about a community way that could solve this. And you have like a technique site that just shows you all the ways you can fetch data and save data with React, and it shows the trade-offs. It's not as low level as like a Stack Overflow, but it's higher level than that and lightly curated, and it just has like at a high level of different kind of philosophical approaches. So I've thought about that with Ember before too. Like if you want to make a modal, there's a couple different ways to do it. If you want to make a button or a link, you can use href or you can use link to. Like, let's talk about both of those things and just have them in one place and have a discussion of the trade-offs. But it was interesting. I just had this thought that was like, that is one thing that's like the areas where Ember does this well, they are good about saying, this is how you do it today. And it's not, attribute bindings or class name bindings. They're like non-ideal APIs. But like also, once you tell me to do that, I'm fine with that. Or like computer properties, specify the dependent keys, and it's going to behave that way. And it's like, I get that we're working towards a future without that. But today, it's good to have that and to do it instead of like just being told about use effect at a really low level, running into stale issue bugs and stale closure state bugs, and then not having those called out in like the guides very well.
I think Ember's router does a good job here. I don't think anyone would say Ember's router is perfect, but yet there's very clear answers to things. Like I need the model hook to always run. Okay, link to ID. Mm-hmm. If we could all snap our fingers and change that, I think we would, but it's also not, it's honest, right?
Yep.
Link to ID, here was the original like intention behind why the model hook doesn't always run. Here's the escape hatch.
Yep.
I
was talking with this fellow and we were talking about how we got into front-end development, and it was making me think back to 2012 when I first got into Ember. And the thing that did it for me, because I was doing Backbone at work, was the router, was Ember's router. And I was just like, because I had just made the survey page and I basically used like push state and pop state myself to make sure like the forward back button worked, the URL worked, and it was crazy like figuring all that out. And then Ember's gave me a router and I was like, wow, blown away. And just today I saw this conversation on Reddit, React.js, about someone coming from Angular to React who was asking, why is the default behavior in React to like click a link and then render a bunch of like immediately throw away the old view, render a bunch of spinners while the new data is fetched, and then render the new page? And why can't you just click a link, wait until you fetch it, don't throw away the old page until you have the data, just like Ember's router works, just like websites work basically. And he was just like, this is crazy or whatever. And then the answers were like, oh yeah, they're working on this with suspense, blah, 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 blah. And there was like different answers for how you could do that today. But it just made me think back to like, it's almost impossible to put yourself in a position where I was in 2012 and to say that something like Ember's router is going to be, because we're so familiar with all the different trade-offs, all the arguing points of the whole ecosystems and blah, 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 blah. Someone who's in 2012 Sam's position is just going to see something like the router and be like, yep, I'm going. And so, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was just interesting to me to think about that, because like, it's just made something easy, and that was all it took. And it wasn't at that point about Ember Data's edge cases, and it wasn't about,
I think this is still true today.
Yeah, but it's like it's easy for us to not to miss out on that. I think it's easy to forget about that.
Yeah.
You get bogged down in the details, and Ember's router is like a really good example of just providing an abstraction that makes someone's life like way easier. And I think it's good. I mean, I know it's good, but I just think it's interesting to think about like, what was someone having a hard time with, and what is the thing that your tool provides how's it going to help them?
I think when you look back on Backbone routing versus Ember's router, the gap there is so massive that there's the details just can't they can't bring Ember's router close to Backbone's router, right? You could say, oh, there's all these trade-offs you need to be aware of, but the fact that you're writing push and pop state, like that just nullifies everything.
Right.
Maybe when we compare tech today, it's sometimes closer, and we maybe incorrectly so, but we allow those details to get involved. But yeah, I still think it matters. I think if someone's facing a problem and you can solve it, especially if they're writing the code, like they're writing the inner workings, the implementation of the abstraction themselves,
right,
and you can solve it, that's huge.
Right.
I don't know.
It's interesting, man. Trade-offs everywhere, literally everywhere. Maybe that's one reason that, you know, Vue has become popular, because it's, in some sense, maybe it's that balance where it's not as much about the details. It's more about, like, the new API. I actually listened to this interesting podcast with Evan on Adam's podcast, Full Stack Radio, and they were like 90% done with a ES6 class-based API for the next version of Vue. And it turned out, did we talk about this on a podcast?
No.
We had a conversation about it. They were going to use an ES6-based system for that, and it turned out to be too difficult to make it. They needed decorators to make the ergonomics good enough. Is that a word, good enough? I'm from the South. And decorators weren't in ES6 yet, right? And so, like, right when he was wanting to finish this, like, decorators weren't done yet. They've been installed forever. They also wanted to make sure Vue played well with TypeScript developers, because that's what there was a lot of people using TypeScript who wanted better type support for their Vue apps. TypeScript, as we talked about with Yehuda, already has decorators. They jumped the gun there, in a sense. And so Evan found himself in a spot where it was hard to meet both sides of it. To meet JavaScript developers with a nice ES6 JavaScript-based API that was also upgradable to, you know, full TypeScript support based on this kind of decorators block. And so, you know, right around then, hooks came out, and then they explored, you know, a function-based approach, because, like, functions and data types is, like, great for type checking and is like a superset over JavaScript in a very clear way, and it doesn't lock out either party or whatever. So they ended up with something called the composition API. But you know, I was playing around with it, and it was kind of like confusing. Like, I refactored some Vue code to use the composition API, and it wasn't, like, clearly better, or, like, I couldn't understand why you would use it instead of the old object syntax or whatever that they had. And then you read more about it, and it's, like, not meant to be the only way you write Vue components. So it's not the same as hooks in that sense. With React and hooks, like, you shouldn't use React class components anymore. There's no reason to. All the features have been replaced with hooks, except for, like, a few, like, edge cases. But basically, you're not supposed to. Like, someone would say just use hooks. In the same way, like, once Octane lands, that's replacing the old way of doing Ember components. With the Vue composition API, that's not true. The Vue composition API is there to give you a way to, like, share behavior in a few areas where it was awkward to do so using the old API.
Is this something that, like, when decorators come to JavaScript, this will disappear?
That ship has sailed. It's too hot. You know, functions are too hot right now. So it's that's all there is. That's all she wrote. That thing is gone. They really did a lot of research and work on it too. But I think they prefer this. But really, just the point being that you know, it's not like a paradigm change. It's not a one way to do it. It's there was a few times where, like, using a Vue component to share, like, a Wi-Fi status thing was awkward, and now you can use the composition API, and it's only if you find yourself reusing it. But Vue has lots of situations where there's, like, multiple ways to do things, which can be annoying, you know, and like, I understand that, and that is one of the appeals of React. Like, there's one way to do things, and it's great until it's not, right? But Vue is much more, you know, poly whatever. It's multi-paradigm. It's willing to sacrifice clarity and the elegance of a single model in order to, help people out. And even if that means giving up, the simplicity. So that's why like Vue is like more complex in a sense. Like there's just different ways of doing things that make sense in different situations. But maybe that's one of the reasons why it's really grown in popularity, because if you need to save a post in many comments, like you might find an answer for that more easily in Vue than you would in either Ember or React. Now, again, Ember has like a way bigger surface area than React, but Vue feels like really, really pragmatic to the max in that sense. So just kind of a thought,
I've only written a few Vue components, so it's hard for me to react to this.
Yeah. Pun intended.
Yeah.
So the part of the reason I was thinking about this is I was making my next app that I made that we talked about.
Your meal tracking app?
Yeah, exactly. Which has been really just
a sea of red X's.
Like a really, judgmental parent the last few weeks. It's been really tough. But a thought I had was, the whole Urkel thing with GraphQL and everything. And it was just like, did we talk about this? Where I was kind of saying like, what would it look like if Ember dropped Ember Data? Did we talk about this on the podcast?
No, this is something we want to hit today.
Yeah. So I think I wanted to, this was like the first time I thought seriously about like what if Ember Data wasn't part of Ember,
Well, we're okay. We're back to the beginning of this episode. Like now I want to save data or fetch data and Ember doesn't have an answer.
I would rather see guides explaining. What I want to see is what I would tell somebody in a bar, which is data fetching and persistence is like the hardest thing about SPAs. The landscape has changed a lot in the last few years. REST has tons of things that are well known about it. And yet a REST spec like JSON API or even just REST in general is only good as the best implementation that your backend has, and only as good as and consistent as your backend team is. And everywhere it's inconsistent, it's going to make your life as a front-end developer harder. GraphQL has evolved to address some of those needs, and the backend implementations for GraphQL are really good. And so, at a high level, I would say like you can have a client-side cache, like an Ember Data, like a Redux, like an Apollo. This is where most of these tools are headed, because you inevitably, pretty quickly, in our cases at least, find that you want that.
I have a question here. Would you tell someone like, oh, go use Apollo, because it handles all these things, or would you tell someone like, here's what you need to be thinking about? You need to be thinking about.
It's a good question.
Identity maps and.
It's a good question. Okay, if I was teaching someone new, in Ember, I think I wouldn't teach them Ember Data to start. I think I would teach them, like, let's say I had someone for 5 days of training. I think the first day definitely would be like, I would provide a server, let's say, and the model hook would just be like a fetch request, which is how I would do it in React or Vue as well. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't get to the notion of like client-side identity until we hit a point, maybe on like day 3 or something, where you fetch a list of recipes and then you click one and then you visit that page. That's when I would bring in like, okay, you already have this in your store, so why do we have to load it again? Now, if we have some sort of store in a context in a React app or in a service in an Ember app, right?
Yeah. You want to identify like, okay, so far this whole training we've been talking about state, like UI state. Here's state that might live outside of your UI.
Exactly.
Global state to that from the app's point of view.
Exactly.
And how would we address that? So service, context, whatever.
Exactly. And then you can say kind of what your options are, but like your options really depend. And like, I don't know, man, that's a good question. Like if it came to like making a recommendation for a team, I mean, what would you want to ask you?
No, you can't flip this around. Come on. I don't know. I'm imagining like a guides page and.
Let's just stop away from that. Let's say, what would you say to a team?
I wouldn't, if I was at a bar and I had like 30 minutes with someone,
Yeah.
I wouldn't try to explain everything to them. I would say use Apollo, use Ember Data, use whatever.
No, what would you actually say? GraphQL, JSON API.
Okay, that's
depending on the
okay.
tech.
Okay.
Let's say they want to make an Ember app. Like
I mean,
they're sold on Ember.
I want to do like a choose your own adventure thing. I would ask them if they already have a backend, and if they're like, no, brand new app, we're reinventing everything. Yeah, I would say use GraphQL. If they say, oh, we've already got a backend, it's REST, and we're thinking of like adding JSON API to it. I would say like every time I've seen this, I've seen it go horribly wrong because 60% of the spec gets implemented, and then someone tries to use that 40%, and they just fall super hard.
Unfortunately, man, it's true. Even these little edge cases with includes and links and stuff. I mean, it's crazy how small the paper cuts have to be for it to have huge ramifications through the front end and back end teams' communication and productivity. It's insane, man.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like the GraphQL stuff is huge. But again, the guy I was talking to today, he was saying like, GraphQL is great for me, but like my back end team is like, they get it, but they don't want to, like they have so much work to do. They can't learn how to implement like a whole new, and I was like, totally. I was like, that's easy for me to say, right? I just push a button on Hasur and I get a GraphQL server. I'm not actually implementing the GraphQL server.
Right.
That being said, I've implemented plenty of API servers, and I know how much the implementations have to do with how productive you can be writing these things. And I know through at least my evaluation through kind of hearsay and just listening to the community is that the GraphQL implementations are really mature and well maintained.
Yeah. Also,
which leads me to believe that the backend team would have an easier time, even if it was new, than if they were building a REST API, because of how many things that they're going to have to decide on their own when it comes to actually implementing that REST API.
Yep.
In a lot of ways.
If they are hooked on REST and they're going to put their foot down and say we don't have time to adopt GraphQL, and I think I would tell a front end developer like, use Ember. You can use Ember Data, but like you're going to be spending a lot of time in serializers and adapters, and like your mental model should be like, how do I prepare this data so that it ends up in the identity map,
right?
In a way that makes sense with my models,
right?
So,
but then there's the Urkel approach, which I wonder how far it would really take you, where you basically punt on a lot of this, or it's like good enough, and it actually doesn't matter that you have like queries that are disconnected from each other, but somehow know how to refresh, but that aren't really connected in this airtight way, in the way that Active Record is with SQL or Ember Data is with a REST API.
There's a few keywords that are used across queries, and you can know that this
Cache
one,
keys.
this one probably affects this one.
Exactly.
I don't know. Like if I were talking to an Ember team, it would be hard for me to bring up something like Urkel just because.
I just wonder. This is the thing, though, man. Like, are we living in an alternate reality? If you were to look at do an actual survey of Ember apps and look at how they're using Ember Data and querying for data, and how often they're calling reload true this and include this that, how often are the data that's powering the view actually being used via like graph traversal in the in-memory ORM, and how much of it is just being fetched from the server at the time it's needed?
Yeah, I would say it's being fetched at the time it's needed. The way I see that, I see that a lot. I think reload true is basically I need to fetch this data because I need it.
Yeah, or yield post.comments.reload. You know what I'm saying? Yield post.comments.reload or something like that.
Yeah.
Reload a relationship. Same idea.
So at this point, we can.
You're not confident like what's there,
right?
You haven't just specified like declaratively the data.
Okay, so this is interesting. Like an app that is using, there's like two types of apps that use Ember Data. There's one that's like just uses the relationships and includes and find all, that sort of stuff. Then there's the other app that uses all those plus the references API. And they use the references API to basically ensure that data is loaded. Yeah. And I think
you could see like every time you reach into the references API is like a violation.
Yeah. It's like I'm using this as a fetch library. Basically, references API, I'm kind of using like okay, this isn't going to be fair, but I'm using like a smarter version of like Axios, right? It understands something about my relationships. It understands it can take like a relationship name and find the links URL, but it's still imperative in the sense that like I need to go off and give it steps how to fetch all the data.
You wouldn't write Rails code like that, controller code like that.
Yeah.
Like
I'm trying to think like,
I guess when you drop down and do like a handwritten join, you're kind of, but yeah.
it would be like, usually when I write Rails code, I want to express everything in like domain relationships. And
Active
then
record.
there might be times where I have to like query a bunch of IDs and then like use those IDs and like a join with like other left table in question mark, the array of all the IDs I got from the first query. Like that happens in Rails. But yeah, that definitely feels like, I think I like this. It feels like I'm not using the ORM to its full potential.
Right.
And I wouldn't surprise me. I think in Ember Data, it's just really easy to get in a bad spot for
if you do that
reason.
1 or 5% of the time in a Rails app, that's fine. If you're doing that 50% of the time, ORM seems like it's more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah.
But it's not true in Rails. But how true is it, in Ember? How true is it in Apollo? Who knows,
I want to get back to Ember should drop Ember Data.
Yeah.
And what is the, like, okay, so I go to the Ember guides. There's a data fetching article.
I know, because like 1 or 2 year ago, Sam would be like that. The thought of that would make him furious, and like this is such a huge value out of Ember. But what would the guide, like the ideal guide, look like if Ember Data was an option? I'm not saying tons of apps depend on Ember Data. I'm not saying it should vanish from existence. I'm just saying it hasn't been a priority of the core team for a long time in a certain sense, and there's a lot of people who struggle with it, so much so that they abandon it or even Ember because of it, and it's not a fault of people. It's just that people who created it. It's more just that like the problem is huge. We talked about this before. Huge unconstrained problem, huge problem space that's changing every year. So Ember should situate itself in such a way that it can take advantage of new innovations like GraphQL and like other things that come along. And as long as it's tied to Ember Data, right now, I think if you are on the GraphQL train, which tons of people are because it's super popular, and you come to Ember's website and you go to the tutorial and you hit the data section and it's talking about REST APIs and all this stuff, you're like, Ember's not for me. And to me, that's like, I know like Jose and the other folks tons of people are using Ember successfully with Apollo, but those people have been in Ember for a long time, and it's not very clear that Ember works well with GraphQL, even though it looks like it does, right? Like it should. There's nothing architecturally about Ember's component model, service model, router, Ember CLI that preclude it from being used successly with GraphQL.
I know, but that's the wrong.
It's a leap.
That's a wrong discussion to have because, if I go and I find some Ember GraphQL code and it's not anything Ember official and the guides make no mention of it, I can't connect those two. Right. Like that's a risk.
And the guides, not even that, the guides are talking about REST APIs everywhere. So so to me, that's a problem. Like I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but to me, that's a problem. Someone should be able to make an Ember app successfully with GraphQL and be able to do so following the guides or following some resources linked to from the guides.
Yeah, I wonder what it would look like. Like how much of a bad spot. Say I wanted to use Urkel Urkel's like React hooks.
I think it is, yeah.
I wanted to use Apollo.
Yeah.
And I wanted to use it with Ember. Like how
or
long?
MobX or MobX is separate. Never mind.
How long till I get in a spot where I'm like doing weird stuff, like wrapping responses in ember.object just to get the rendering system working?
Yeah.
Like if that happens quickly, then that's a problem.
Right.
But maybe I can get pretty far without that.
Yeah, if you call this .set, you're not mutating. You need Ember models are observable, and you can do like user.set first name. But maybe if you're just querying data and calling this .set result, then it doesn't matter. Like Ember will re-render whenever you do that. It's like users as a tracked property or something like that, right? You know what I mean?
Sure, kind of.
I'm just making, making things up now.
I want to see if like how far I can get before it's oh, I need to have actual knowledge of Ember's KVO system here.
Yeah, but I don't think the KVO thing matters as much with...
Because I'm not calling set.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. By the way, side note, I watched this little presentation about MobX, which is popular state management library in React, and it's pretty crazy. It seemed like super leaky. I'd be interested if anyone has experience and loves MobX. Again, because I think MobX is the kind of thing that if we were doing React a couple of years ago, we would probably reach for, because it's like we want a global store of our server resources. But like you have like a store with like your resources, but then everywhere we use them in a render function, you have to wrap it in like a use observable function so that you can use mutation in your store methods, like add post. You can do like post store.post.push, and it will re-render, but only if you wrap it. You're not in React state, so you have to wrap the render function in like a use observable. It felt really weird to me. So I would just be curious, because I know a lot of people who have used MobX love it.
So it would be like modifying some object that MobX knows about, and then like set X to X plus 1, so React knows to...
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
Exactly. So that was kind of interesting side note. And just had me thinking, like, this person that I watched introducing it was talking about, look how easy it is. Mutation. This is not like Redux. I just get to call state.post.push, and mutation is like a benefit of MobX, which is like the opposite of what the core team of React would say, which is that mutation is like a bad design decision in the JavaScript language, and everything we're doing is about avoiding mutation.
No, but
goes back to the whole functional stuff.
Right, sure. But does MobX might still have
under the
hood, like maintain everything, but you just get, APIs that you think you're mutating.
So is that like, I mean, I guess that's a good question that I didn't really ask when we were talking about all this stuff a few weeks ago. If you use a library like Ember that gives you a mutable API with functional immutable data under the hood, are you still like good to go in the functional programmers books, or is it like you're thinking about this wrong and you're not actually going to get the benefits of the functional programming model?
I mean, if it catches the mutation foot guns by preventing the things that happen when you have mutation, like having to open a bunch of files to find where the array is being mutated, if the APIs can prevent that from happening, then...
But like do you have a pure function anymore? If you call push, even if under the hood it's doing like a splat or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, functional, sure.
How?
If
you give me a
myself
store,
into a corner here.
If you give me a store and if I write a function that takes a store and I call store.post.push,
I think the idea is that I still have old state, and then I call store.push, and I didn't modify that old state. I get new state.
It's like
a new re-render.
I'm so confused now.
I have old state. I still get new state.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the way that API was that re-render happened.
Yeah.
I didn't have to consider, I'm making a new array here.
I feel like there's a gap in my understanding here. I know this is a tangent, but I thought the idea of functional programming, in that it minimizes state and pushes side effects to the edge, makes your code more easy to reason about and follow, because every function is pure and can be tested on its own, and data doesn't change out from under you. So,
but maybe that's what it is. Maybe we're pushing the side effect to the edge. Like we still get the mutable API, but like the side effect, we're not like mutating the array in our code, in our component. We're calling push, and then push is going all the way out to this global store, doing its thing there, doing another top-down re-render.
Couldn't you implement all of Ruby's APIs with a functional thing underneath, and then all of a sudden, boom, Ruby's functional? It just has a mutable API on top of an immutable implementation.
Couldn't you
implement Ruby's mutable methods with immutable data structures and functions underneath, and you wouldn't even know it?
No, because Ruby has methods where I do like a equals array, a dot push exclamation point. It's gonna modify, or a dot push. That's gonna modify a, And so anything that had a reference to that original A gets modified.
Okay, so you're saying, I see. So push feels like mutation, but really it's not mutating anything. It's always returning a new store array.
Yeah.
So if you had array equals up here, like x dot posts, store dot posts up here, and then down here you have the same store. It is the same store because it's like a value to the provider. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a whole new store.
I mean, you could have a store that has stores inside of it, and it tracks all the changes between them.
Store is just a reference to pop of the stack of stores. So you have a store up here in the store, in the provider store. And then, let me do this. Okay, so you have store and the provider in the context of the root of your app. And then you pass it all the way down. This guy has a button, you click on it, and it gets local, use context dot store dot posts dot push. And this guy up here, like that thing is going back up here to the root, and it's basically going to call like set state with like a new store essentially. So anyone who has the store, it's like
it doesn't change out from underneath
them.
There's a great in that
interesting
Learn You Haskell book.
Yeah,
there's a great thing. We're going to make a functional stack, so we can push and pop items onto the stack. You might think like push and pop are like violations. This stack data structure can't exist in a functional programming language. And the way they do it is that when you push an item, you get back a new stack as well as a new pop and a new push function. So the idea is that like you still have a stack API, but push is pushing,
it's returning a new.
It's like returning a new object, a new array,
and a new function with reference to the new array.
So you can think about like if anyone ever had that old array, no item is ever getting pushed onto that old array.
Interesting.
So maybe that's like how we can think about getting these mutable APIs in a functional world. I think this is the whole idea behind like monads. I think monads come up here, but
that's it. That's where it ends.
That's where it ends.
Yeah, I got you. Interesting. Cool. So anyways, that was a big long tangent. The reason we started talking about that, for the two of you still listening, the reason we started talking about that was because that was, what were we talking about before I made that aside? Oh, God. Ember Data. So, yeah.
You can't keep making asides.
I'm getting out of the question.
What do the guides look like? Okay, data fetching.
All I will say is when I was doing that demo thing, when I was building my little side project with Urkel and GraphQL, I had this very strong, it was my gut, man. It was a little angel devil inside of me. I don't know what it was, but it was like Ember having Ember Data is like really bad for Ember. That's how I felt. And I have had so much good years working with Ember Data.
Yeah.
But I just felt like.
Do you feel like it's holding us back?
People are going to blame Ember for their bad experience with Ember Data. That feels unfair to me. It feels fair, but it's totally understandable, but it feels unfair because like, especially with Octane, once it's released, I think it would be in the same way that found this like me making this app in 4 hours, like really compelling. Someone could have a similar experience with Octane and Hasura, let's say, but they're not going to. They're not going to. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's like a problem for folks who care about Ember adoption.
Yeah, I would be really interested to see what the guides are like if they can only point to third-party libraries.
Yeah.
And say, hey, I think you can still have an opinion of how data.
Totally. And you can say like, look, a lot of people have invested a lot of effort in Ember Data. There's a lot of great things about it. There's also like these edge cases that people run into and can be problematic. We think plenty of teams can do it successfully, but we also acknowledge that there's been a lot of development outside of it. And, JSON API didn't take off the way we were hoping, and it doesn't have the community resources that we were hoping for. There's still good options for it, but, GraphQL is something you shouldn't ignore at this point. And the tooling around it is really incredible. And so if you're going to go down that path, here's how you would do it with Ember. Even that would be, even at the beginning of the part of the tutorial and the guides that start talking about Ember Data and REST, something that said that. GraphQL wasn't around when Ember Data was made. It's since become has a huge foothold in the front end community. And if you're going to go down that, click on this guide to read all about using GraphQL with Ember. in like one page that's like just you should check out Ember Apollo because there's an add-on that's maintained and used by these production companies and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see like how comfortable we get like with kind of
Ember
nudging people outside of using Ember, but
Yeah.
nudging people outside of the Ember ecosystem
Yeah.
for certain things.
Yep. Yeah, it's tough balance.
I mean, I never really thought of the whole Octane thing. I think that's actually a pretty good point that like someone plays with Octane and like, wow, this is awesome. Okay, let me hook this up to
A back end.
My
Like you want
back
to
end.
have the success I had with
yeah.
React in a weekend.
But that's a bummer.
It's super bummer. No, I want to actually make an Octane app with GraphQL stuff on the back end and just see what that looks like.
I'm worried that you have too much Ember experience and you might reach for, you just know how to vet Ember add-ons. And
Right.
And you might know which Ember GraphQL add-on to use just based on like the authors.
Yeah.
and
I personally, sorry.
Where if you were using React, you might be like kind of say, no, I want to see something in the docs or I want to wait till like something's hugely popular.
Urkel was nice because it's lower level than Apollo. Apollo feels like a lot to learn. I still haven't gone through the tutorial yet. But a lot of people doing GraphQL and who have been for years say just use Apollo. And people say that in Ember too. Like there's an Ember Apollo thing and that's what people use. So I think if we were going to build a real production application using a GraphQL, we would like take the time to learn Apollo and probably end up using that because it seems like the right fit. But as someone who's a weekend warrior in this other area and wants to just toy with these and get a good win on the weekend or whatever, Urkel was literally perfect for it because it was just enough and it behaved exactly as I needed it to for my app and worked great with Hasura and everything. So,
Pretty cool.
yeah. Again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, like it's the same thing where the fellow I was talking to was saying like he's been doing React day to day for 6 years, but has always kind of had a midnight affair with Ember that whole time where he uses it for side projects and is always talking about it at work and likes so much of the ideas in there, even though he also loves React, but finds himself feeling like he's re-implementing so much Ember when he's doing React for work. And I remember that struck me because Chris Freeman and Brandon Hayes said the same thing. They moved away from Ember for a project and used like a React node stack and ended up going back to Ember because it was like the same thing. They were like, there's no consensus around this part or that part or that part. By the time you wire it all up, you're responsible for how these parts talk to each other. And so they just felt like they were re-implementing what they knew was in Ember and React. And so I found interesting to hear him say that as well.
I have two thoughts. The first is like, that's a really good spot for Ember to be.
Yeah.
That's like a really good spot when like people are using other tools and they're thinking, oh, how would I do this in Ember? The other thought I had is like, man, we got to like, what's going on in Ember that people are using other tools? Like what's the friction?
Why people are not using Ember?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there's some
Good
fact
ideas.
the fact that people want to use Ember or they want to think how does Ember do
Right.
this, and yet they're off using another tool. There's another piece of the story. There's some other friction in Ember that why Ember isn't being used.
Right. The way to take that is not to stop and say, look at that, Ember's got all the right pieces. It's like, no, it's like, what are you so blinded by that is causing people, to not use Ember, given that in spite of all these great pieces, so that's pretty interesting. Another thing that came up in this conversation was how sometimes you hit paradigms that don't align with each other when using different tools in React. So this guy was talking about Next.js and Apollo and how they actually don't work well together because Apollo is more like Ember Data and it wants to know about what your application is like fetching in order to like build a graph of data it needs to like render this page. Whereas Next.js, which is the Zeit's React framework, has some architectural decisions that it makes where you like split pages up by file, and then the page is responsible for knowing like what the data is via get initial props, which is like a static property that now can run in the server before it returns your React component to the client. So
Why are those two
The
things?
reason I brought this up was because we were talking about Ember's router and good ideas and re-implementing it. This is now I'm remembering. So when I started writing React, when we were writing React, like we did the same thing. We were like building a client-side cache with like hooks and context. And when we built a Gatsby site for Mirage.js, we built like our little router thing. We like opted out of like the page per page routing and just used React Router and built like a conventional thing that was pretty similar to Ember's router, right? And because we're thinking about that. So your kind of question was like, what's lacking where people are like asking how would I do this in React the way Ember does it, right? So there's this interesting thing that this guy was talking about where trying to bring these paradigms together sometimes are in conflict because there's no one in React saying, here's how we think you should do X, here's how we think you should do Y, which again is like both sides of it, right? On the one hand, it leaves up more ambiguous for the developer to make up on their own. On the other, it leaves React ecosystem to be more flexible and able to innovate faster. So he was saying where this can come at a head sometimes is when the paradigms disagree. So if you listen to Guillermo's talk, the creator of Zeit, and Zeit is the owner of the Now project, you hear him say that like fundamentally, you don't want your application to be in control of routing because as your app grows, every route that comes in has to go through your whole app and your app becomes a bottleneck, right? So that was what his point was on like the Full Stack Radio interview, which is why Next like bundles at the route level and Zeit's architecture, like now the hosting platform can actually be the first entry point at the routing layer and direct the request to the single bundle that needs to handle it, almost like a PHP server does. And so instead of having to render your whole Ember app, boot the Ember application instance and the router, read in all the router tree and know all the components and everything just to render one page. Now's architecture is based on like not doing that, like having a single page that has just the components needed to render that page, and it has a static property called getInitialProps, which is like their solution to the problem that React only has rendering, so you can't fetch then render. You have to render first because that's all there is in React. So what Next does is have this static property getInitialProps that you can implement and run that before you render. So his point was like Next is a really popular way to build React apps. Apollo is a really popular way to do data fetching and mutation in React apps, but they actually don't play well together because Apollo doesn't really kind of assumes like it is running all the time, just like you would imagine with Ember Data in an Ember app, right? And so there's a conflict there sometimes where like, I don't know the details of it, if it's like the cache breaks across pages and across routes because it's split up or something like that, and you're running some code in the server and it doesn't know about the cache data and the client. I'm not really sure how it breaks down.
Interesting.
But
I can definitely see it like the router example. It's almost like you're describing each page as like its own mini app with only the components that it needs.
Yes.
And
which is it's cool in one sense, and I get how it can improve it, but on the other sense, it's like you lose a lot of the benefits. We've talked about this before. Like the reason we didn't want to even do that with our Gatsby site is because like you have some animation in the header, or you want it to just be fast. You just want to load it up ahead of time, and then the rest of the page is fast. The app is fast because it's all loaded, like the way add-on doc sites work or whatever. Sometimes that's better. I mean, that's how iOS apps work. You download the whole app. So it's just a difference. It's trade-offs, of course, but I like nested routing. Seems like a huge benefit of SPAs. So both of those kind of work against that philosophy. Anyways, just another point about this whole discussion, which is like, do you want the framework to be thinking about things ahead of time and all holistically and providing you with a holistic answer with all the pieces that work in harmony with each other? Or do you want to be lower level and let different solutions emerge? And, there's some tension there. Frameworks are really good though,
Yeah, I've heard.
Like imagine, just think back to the days before Rails, how much time Rails saves, you know. Anyways, I don't know what the conclusion is here. There are trade-offs in software. That's about all I got.
I still want to know what's on the Ember Data guides.
Yeah, that's a good. I think that's a great way to frame that, because when I was like in my ecstasy of my React programming, and I was like, Ember Data definitely should not be part of Ember, and also like helping out some folks in the last few weeks, like some consulting and mentoring work we do, and I was like, man, like this stuff it's brutal. Like,
I mean, that's also like that's like brutal. The reality.
Yeah.
Of I have this hypothesis, and that's where this is coming from. Like, yes. The reality is it's funny. It's really hard to describe these situations too.
It's so hard to say, like, it's the time you spend with the normalize and the serialize, and then even then you don't get it right, or even then your back end is a little inconsistent. So the front end person's just going to do what they need to do, because like they're working with whatever the back end team is giving them, and it's not consistent. Doesn't adhere to a spec. And so this is the way you can get data at this particular point, and here's how you're going to do it. And you would have been better off like writing a fetch request at that point. Like you would have, and just rendering what was there, because like the way the app works, that is actually would have been way better, because
you spent all this time trying to do the ORM way, and then you get towards the, you get 80% of the way there, and then to close out that 20%, you end up just doing fetch requests.
Yeah, exactly.
In some indirect way.
Yes, you're doing it in a very convoluted way. Now, again, I'm not saying my conclusion here is not that we don't need like a client side like data fetching caching library. It's just that if it's not complete, it's maybe worse than having one. You know, again, if active record only worked 50% of the time, and 50% of the time you were diving down and writing custom SQL, which people do when they use Rails because they don't take the time to learn how to use active record in the way it was intended. We've worked with people who do that, who are writing a bunch of SQL in their Rails apps. And of course you're going to be like, I hate Rails, I hate active record. Why am I even wrapping my SQL queries in this thing, right? Mm-hmm, but that's not the problem in that case, right? And you can blame the developer in that case, because SQL is a standard thing, and they're just doing things their old way. But you can't blame the person with the Ember Data situation, because they don't have SQL. It's not just up to them to learn how to use it well. It's up to like the backend team to implement it well, which is based on the actual implementations of like this particular thing, right? There's a lot more moving pieces there.
You can imagine a backend and ops team working together and very easily agreeing on SQL, or a front end and back end team working together.
Maybe all sorts of reasons.
Maybe they would very easily agree on something, but they just don't have the words or the experience to
or even the
communicate
tools.
what that thing is. Yeah,
dude, does the EmberMap have a perfectly implemented backend, JSON API? Like, no. I mean, it's good. I would say like it works pretty well. Like there's a lot of code we had to write ourselves to get.
I mean, just like Ember Data itself is a subset of JSON API, right. What it gives you access to, what it considers a valid JSON API.
We had to write storefront in order to make it work well,
No.
For how we best understood it.
So I wonder, going back to the like, would you teach someone about identity maps and client-side data and state outside of UI? Maybe giving them enough tools where they can put together their own storefront thing.
Well, the answer is, would I teach them? Yes, absolutely, because every ecosystem has this. Even if you're in React, which is like the lowest level, you're going to come across Redux, you're going to come across, which is like state, which is like a global state, and it's a notion of identity outside of the UI hierarchy that multiple components have access to and reference the same thing. That's a super important part of UI development. So you should understand those ideas and what problems they're solving. But when it comes time to like what you use, and again, like even if you're using something like an Urkel that has like a naive cache busting strategy, you are going to run into bugs, right? In my app, it was super simple. I didn't run into bugs, but there's an intermediate state there that's impossible, where I create a new meal, revisit the homepage, and the homepage is stale while the query is refetching. Now it's fast enough in my case, and the UI was kind of resilient to that state that it didn't actually matter. But you can think of, there's so many situations where that's not true. an employee shows that it's terminated and it's not terminated, and it's like the person like, this thing is buggy. Like that happens all the time.
Yep.
So does the stale data matter? And you need to understand like what are the situations where your UI can be stale and why is that happening? And it's because of that. So, and then as far as like the actual concrete recommendations, that depends on the situation. Does your backend team know GraphQL? Are they comfortable? Have they done this before? Okay, if they're using REST, does everyone understand these notions of how we're doing relationships? Okay, in that case, we should do this or that. That would change. What, you think I'm still evading the question?
No, I don't. I'm thinking of like backend teams don't have this problem. They use SQL and everyone knows how to manage.
What about
SQL.
MySQL versus Postgres?
That's not a big deal. Like that's not.
I bet I could find you a backend developer.
I'm sure we could find 100, but that's really not. That's not a big deal. I've worked on huge Rails apps that do both, and that's not that big of a deal. Where with the front end team, it is a big deal because you have to go convince the back end team. The back end team has to convince you. No one is going to argue about like the best way to store a MySQL table on disk, right? There's just like they're going to they agree to use MySQL. We don't have that, and that's like all these problems now.
Dude, it's crazy, man. I tweeted about this a few weeks ago. It's like every front end team has to create this for themselves, and it's super hard. Imagine if every backend team had to recreate something like SQL. They would get a bunch of stuff wrong. They would argue. They would waste a lot of time.
That's it. That's what we're doing now.
Yeah,
and I guess like
we're recreating a standard for data fetching and mutation.
Well, okay, so I guess like Ember Data and JSON API were supposed to be like
the standard. Yeah,
the rationalization of this. So
yes, why didn't it work? Because it's too constrained. People render from JSON, and so now it's like you're actually not really solving people's problems in the way you thought you were. The JSON API spec was literally designed to be read into a client-side identity map. But if people aren't reading their JSON, the
people are rendering JSON.
Exactly. If they're rendering from their API, all of a sudden you've just made their lives a lot harder. So GraphQL comes along.
What's the benefit of this?
Exactly. GraphQL comes along and says, look, our queries, we're going to go beyond that. Make sure our queries are only exactly what you need to render directly to your page. And so everyone's going to jump on board. I mean, that's, ex post storytelling, but I think there's something to that. And JSON API was made to be read into a client-side identity map. And so if you're not building your app like that, then the benefits don't. I mean, there's still benefits because like there's just like, where do we put our attributes here? Where do we put our relationships here? It's great. But I don't see why you would build a REST API without JSON API at this point, because you're just going to be literally creating something yourself, a standard.
You can start with a REST API, but you'll get to JSON API eventually.
Yeah, because you're just going to bike shed about it, and it's very well thought out. You just might end up writing your own like serializers or something like that. But anyways, no, I think that's what we were talking about the other day. The GraphQL stuff it's a nice, because GraphQL isn't as much convention as we would want, but it does lock you down in terms of, when the client makes this request, what does the server respond with? Like in REST, you can do anything. Like nothing's telling you that it's not going to work. But with GraphQL, at least you have that, where you don't have anything that goes beyond that. You don't have what are the queries for a given resource. It doesn't have a notion of resources. It just has, it's lower level. But at least it does get the types right, and that gives you it lets you build on top. It's like you can take your SQL knowledge from one backend to another. And now if you know GraphQL, I can jump into a new app and pull up graphical and understand a lot about how to get data from your backend. If I jump into your app that does REST, like, again, dude, some of the people I've been working with the last few weeks, like, it's like get/post, but when you want to save it, you do a get to /post/save, like, whatever it is. It's all over the place. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And then throw relationships in there and you're just done. Like you're done. So that's the reality of the data fetching landscape. And if that's the reality of the data fetching landscape, assuming that people are working with a super structured, consistent API and you're getting started tutorial, I think is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think that's one of the areas where the Ember Data stuff is problematic for me.
I actually like how we got here. I'm satisfied with this.
Because it's a pragmatic thing.
Yeah, these APIs aren't structured. Even the JSON APIs backends that we work with,
they're inconsistent.
We could point to a million things and say that's a violation of a spec, but that's how they got implemented. And in their point of view, they're using JSON API.
Right.
But because they're inconsistent, that means that if you try to have the opinionated data fetching layer,
right,
you set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, totally.
Do you think that Ember went? I don't know what I'm asking. Do you think that Ember, JSON API is like a product of people working on Ember? Do you think it was too hard to solve both like the client side ORM and then the transport protocol layer at the same time, where it's like we had SQL and then later on we could do ORMs. It in like phases.
Well, yeah, I think that's what GraphQL is doing, right? GraphQL is just taking the transport layer and saying, at the very least, we can guarantee if you send me a post request with this body, I can tell you whether it's valid, exactly how it's not valid, and if it is, give you exactly the response you would always get, no matter what, in any GraphQL environment. It's a spec, it's hard, blind, it's, we have libraries that are going to verify it. The official GraphQL library is going to tell you this is a field, it doesn't exist in the schema, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, they're basically just taking on the protocol, which has an influence for how your client-side data works, but it has implications there. But no, it's a smaller piece of the problem for sure. I think it was a big problem. I think it was just a bigger problem than anyone realized at the time.
Oh yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
Right, because I think when Ember Data first came out, I was super excited about it because to me, I saw Active Record.
Right.
And Active Record works really well. So why wouldn't this work well?
Right. Interesting. Well, I think it'd be really cool to see like an Octane GraphQL guide. I think that would be super interesting and appealing to a lot of people, for folks who care about Ember adoption.
I know, but when you say that, it's not enough for it to be like a guide or a blog post. Like I want to see like the official. I want to know what's going to make someone successful when Octane comes out. Like what's going to make people go nuts over Octane, go bananas over Octane. And if it's like, oh yeah, there's a blog post over here about how to use GraphQL with Octane. Like that's not enough, I guess.
Tackling like the official guides and stuff is harder for me. I think if you see a 10-15 minute video of someone using Octane, which I think is really clean programming model with like a Hasura backend and GraphQL, that would be pretty exciting for a lot of people, because I think a lot of the Octane programming idioms are going to be more clear and easy to understand than like someone who's just diving into use effect for the first time. It's like just Ember, I think you could do it.
I'm not. Yeah.
I think you could do it.
I think you're right about the guides.
Ember's routers with model and returning effectively something like a, even with like a background. Well, I guess that's Ember Data thing, background reload. I was going to say, but that's basically what Urkel does. That's what I'm thinking. If you had something like Urkel in the model hook, you return a promise that is cached and then busts its cache if the type name changes. Because GraphQL has a notion of a type name. And so that's how Urkel is keeping track of like at the cache keys. And so you create a thing, you go back, it renders sync from cache, but then it does a background reload. That's like what I would like to see. To me, that's like a minimum version of a Octane, a full stack, a full Octane app with a GraphQL backend. That would be interesting to me. Because otherwise, what are you going to do? What are you going to do for your backend? You're going to go make a JSON API. I'm never going to do that again. Or a Rails API layer. Like, those things exist for me already. I mean, I might do that, but
no, it's
probably
too much.
Not.
You're just
for the weekend warrior constraint.
You're not going to be successful.
Yeah. It's just too much.
Originally, I was thinking like 10 minutes.
I'm old. I want to build an app in 4 hours. That's my tolerance. I'm not even going to install Ruby on my, whatever, Rails, get it working.
So originally I was thinking this is like a guides thing, and not that we need to come up with new guides, but I think you're right in that it's not.
I mean, React doesn't have guides for this, but I can do it because the community has made resources and stuff.
I guess I want to watch you Weekend Warrior Octane because you know enough about Ember, about the Ember guides, and about where you just naturally know.
Where I would just leave the guides and go do my own thing.
Right. So if I said GraphQL, you would know what, like, if I said data fetching, you would know where in the guides to look. If I said GraphQL, you would just know where to go. So
right.
I want to watch you Weekend Warrior Octane, and I want to see where you jump out. How long you spend outside,
right?
At what points you come back in,
right?
I think that would be
interesting.
I don't think the guides. I think it would be a mistake to rewrite the guides for like GraphQL.
Sure,
that's a ton of work,
and
we don't even know that it's the right thing to do.
Sure. Definitely not saying everyone should be writing GraphQL servers. Definitely not saying that.
Right.
100% not saying that. I'm just saying I'm also saying it's not right for Ember to be so prescriptive in this area. It's too prescriptive, and it locks people out, and it makes them feel like Ember is not for them, when in fact I think it could be, because there's good architectural boundaries here. There's better architectural boundaries in Ember than are let off by the guides and the community perception. So again, people are successfully using Ember with Apollo and GraphQL. But if you didn't know them and didn't happen to see them in a conference talk or something, you wouldn't know that.
That's interesting. So I absolutely agree with that statement, and that's interesting. I wonder, that would be a really good conference talk or a really good guide. Like, what are the boundaries in Ember Data?
Yeah,
between all the Ember Data components.
No, I'm talking about boundaries in Ember. Like, Ember Data is not actually coupled to Ember. Ember is not coupled to Ember Data. Yeah.
So I would want to know, but there are boundaries within Ember Data, and there's boundaries within Ember.
I remember we were just at the meetup last week, the Ember meetup, and we were talking to, I think her name was Jia Ying, who works at Adapar, where the meetup was hosted, I believe, and she was newer to Ember for the last year, and for her, Ember Data and Ember they are all Ember APIs. That's what I'm saying. That's kind of where I'm coming from. That's a problem to me, in the sense that if you are all aboard the Apollo, the GraphQL train, you're gonna be like, oh, okay, Ember is not for me.
Okay, wow, okay, that's it. Okay,
I should have maybe said that earlier, but
no. This actually clearly shows a problem, because in my mind, component API and actions and set and get are off in their own little space and belongs to and models are here, and here's the boundary between them. Here's where Ember model extends Ember object.
Right. But that's not, I don't think most people have that clear of an understanding. That's like an expert level thing or whatever. That's just, that's not, when you learn Ember, you just learn it all,
Yeah. No, it makes total sense.
Yeah. So, that'd be pretty interesting. Basically the model hook, right? You can plug and play that thing, and you can still write an app.
Yep.
All right, I think we beat this horse about 5 times over. It'll be interesting to see. I might have. We'll see if I have the energy to do that when Octane is released. I think it'd be fun, just an Octane app with GraphQL backend. I don't know, just go crazy, queries and model hooks like a savage. We'll see. Cool. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Actually, we probably won't, because it's Christmas next week. So we'll probably see you in a couple weeks. And we hope everyone has...
Yeah, we might be done for the year.
Yeah, we might be done for the year. Yep. So, I'm going to be in... I was going to say sunny Florida, but that is not where I'm going to be. That's where I was for Thanksgiving. I'm going to be in chilly Minnesota. Brutally chilly Minnesota. But I'm going to get to hang out
6-degree weather.
Yeah, I think it was... -10 the other day when I looked. It's pretty cool. But it's going to be 20 when I get there. Hang out with the nieces and nephews. It should be fun.
Nice.
Drink some whiskey. Hopefully I'll be over this cold. Just enough to get it again.
By the way, your voice has gotten way worse
I know,
since we started this episode.
I know this morning I felt so good. I know. We'll see. Anyways, gonna get some rest now. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. We'll see you next year. Bye-bye.